to have a brief outline of the Philippines history and how it got to. Yeah, okay, great. So, do I have a certain amount of time?
I don't think so. The government hasn't said anything, so I think we have time.
Okay.
And if it's all right when you're done, I think we have a couple questions. If they don't get answered. Yeah, if they don't get answered in your presentation.
Sure. Okay. All right. So I'll begin then. So hi everyone. My name is Ellen Cachola. I'm a professor here at the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I'm going to be doing a presentation on the Philippines. So thanks so much for inviting me to share what I know about it. And so some of the things that I will cover is a general outline of how I understand the history of the Philippines from the pre-colonial, colonial to the current government that we have today. And to begin, I guess I wanted to situate the Philippines, this pre-colonial Philippines, in a regional history. So the word Philippines is actually not indigenous to the island, the archipelago that we know. So it's this set here. It's a really small one, but I just wanted to show a regional map. But anyway, the Philippines, that word comes from the Spanish. King Philip II, who was a colonizer of the Philippines, had created that name. So it's not the true indigenous name of the Philippines. In actuality, the Philippine Islands, which is currently known as this whole archipelago, in the pre-colonial time, it was not unified in that way. There were different kingdoms that occupied different parts of the islands that are currently here. So we have the Northern Island, and there are a couple of kingdoms here. And the Visayas, which is this middle area, also had a different political system. And the Mindanao area is also a different kingdom. And so during this era, there was a complex social system, a hierarchical system where the Maginu, Raja, or Datu were considered the chiefs or the leaders of these different kingdoms. Maharlika and Timawa were considered the freemen or the tradesmen or the different merchants and skilled people that helped to create the society's economy, the education system, the religious systems, etc. And then the Alipin were considered the servant class. So it was a hierarchical society, and it was also because the Philippines was part of a very robust economic trade in the region. So the picture on the right here shows the kind of items that were being bought and sold in the pre-colonial era. Fabrics, foodstuffs like honey and gold. We would trade a lot of things on earthen jars called burnai, which are earthen jars that would be vessels to hold a lot of items that would be traded with Chinese, Japanese, and Southeast Asian merchants. So if you guys heard of the Silk Roads that Marco Polo was involved in, coming from Italy across Eurasia and into China. So the Philippines was part of maritime Silk Road industry. So the ocean aspect of that economy. So this was back in the 1100s when Marco Polo was writing about it. So the Philippines was part of that economy. Spanish colonialism occurred around 1521, and the Spanish arrived in the island of Cebu. And the Filipinos at first, welcomed the Spanish to come, but they started to see this is actually Magellan. So he was the first one to supposedly have documented his arrival in the Philippine Islands. And he was actually noted for being greedy. And so that a lot of the indigenous people of the island of Cebu, specifically Bataan Island, rebelled against Magellan and actually killed him. And so that was the historic moment there when a lot of Filipinos were suspicious of Spanish colonialism. But when word got back to Spain that the Philippines had a lot of these economic relationships in the Spice Islands, the Spanish continued to come, and they brought missionaries and more military, and they basically utilized divide and rule to pit certain tribes against other tribes. So most of the Spanish colonialist stronghold took hold of the central part of the island of Luzon, which is the top island here, and you can see the red area is where most of the strongholds and the mission systems were established. And I believe you guys are all part of San Francisco or the Bay Area, and I know you guys have missions there because I studied at San Francisco and then UCLA, and I studied the history of the mission systems up and down the California coast. So it's a similar process, actually, of the Christianization of the Filipinos in the Northern Island. So you had that, the more Hispanicized Filipinos start to be part of the Spanish imperial economy that was stretching from Spain into the Caribbean and Mexico, all the way across the Pacific into the Philippines, in order to access the spice routes, the trade with China, as this map depicts. And so a lot of the Spanish colonial administration actually was centered in Mexico for a time. And so there was a lot of movement of, a lot of the things that the native Filipinos were building in terms of the Spanish colonial time was ships. So they would log a lot of the trees in order to create the ships for this trade that the Spanish was dominating at the time. But towards the waning of the Spanish Empire, imperialism, there's a lot of different powers vying in the Pacific. It was Spanish, German, British, French, Dutch, and so empires rise and fall, and eventually the Spanish fell and American empire rose to take over the Spanish colonies. And so this was around 1898. And so America wanted to take some of the Pacific Islands, trading some of the Spanish ones into American rule. So Guam and the Philippines were in the Pacific, and they were both Spanish colonies. And then Puerto Rico was in the Caribbean, and Cuba as well. And so one of the things that the Americans wanted to do was to pacify the Filipinos, because at first the Americans helped the Filipinos fight against the Spanish to get rid of them around 1898. And that was successful. The Spanish were defeated. But what happened was the Americans ended up saying that we're going to be your new colonial power. And that angered the native Filipinos because they wanted to have their sovereignty. And so that led to the Filipino-American War. And I apologize for this very traumatic picture, but it's the picture of American soldiers engaging in a torturous act of the water cure upon native Filipinos that were fighting against them during the Filipino-American War. And so this war was one of the tactics that Americans tried to do to dominate the Philippine Islands. And also they used education to try to create this benevolent assimilation, or this notion of pacifying the Filipinos through education. And so the Filipinos were among other islands that were suffering to this imperialism. So we also had Hawaii, Puerto Rico, as I mentioned earlier, were part of this spread of the U.S. empire across the Pacific and into the Caribbean. And this was all part of America's constitutional transformation, because within the contiguous 48 states that are in the continental United States, and also Alaska and Hawaii, you're all included in the Constitution. So you all have protections under the Constitution of the United States. But for these other outerlying islands, they were considered possessions of the United States, but they were not protected under the Constitution. And so they're not treated equally in Philippine or American law. So when Philippines was under America, it was not allowed to, it was actually never given a kind of a voting rights, but the lands were used for military purposes, and the Filipino people could fight in the military starting from 1901. But then eventually 1946 rolled around, and we experienced World War II. So the Japanese also was another imperial power in the region, because when Western imperialism was in Asia, the Japanese saw this kind of ways in which these different countries were carving up Asian countries, and they didn't want to be subjected to that kind of colonization. So in order to prove themselves to these Western powers, the Japanese said, don't colonize us because we're just like you. We can be imperial and we can extract resources from other countries as a demonstration of our power. And so they... Hello?
Breaking up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So they... I can also hear there's a lot of background noise, like loud stuff, so I'm not sure if that's just like movement.
I think it's better now.
Okay. So yeah, so is there any questions so far?
What happened in 1946?
Well, 1946 was World War II when it ended, but the Japanese Empire was rising back into the early 1900s. And it was, for example, the Sino-Japanese War, the attack on China, and then they also colonized Korea. And then it eventually expanded into Southeast Asia around World War II. So 1942 this is a map of that spread. And so the Japanese occupation of the Philippines was at one point seen as an act of solidarity of Asian countries trying to unify against these Western empires. But eventually the Japanese control of the region proved to be very brutal. And among the types of things that the Japanese did was this picture on the top right, the Bataan Death March. So there was a time when the Americans also helped the Filipinos during Japanese occupation. Because if you remember, there was the Axis powers, which were Germany, Italy, Japan. They were under the fascist kind of governments. And then there was also the Allied powers, which were the Western European countries and America. So the Allied powers were trying to support the Filipino people. But during a section of the world, during World War II, the Japanese overtook the American and the Filipinos. And one of those moments was the Bataan Death March, when they captured Filipino and American soldiers and forced them to walk from the Corregidor, which is a coastline in the central part of the Philippines, to a prison of war camp in a more internal area of the island. And a lot of Filipinos and Americans died together doing this death march. Another thing that the Japanese did in its empire was establish the comfort women system, which was the basically killing of many men in the villages and then rounding up the women and the girls and forcing them into sexual slavery as part of maintaining the morale of soldiers. And so this was a systemic form of sexual terrorism that was established throughout the Japanese imperial colonies. And so when the Americans came back in 1946 with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that ended the Japanese empire. A lot of Filipinos were very patriotic to America for coming and helping them end the war with the Japanese occupation, because of how brutal that was too. And so America ended up rebuilding the Philippines again and establishing the form of government that we have today. And so the Philippine Republic was established in 1946, towards the end of the same year as the end of the World War II, but now into the creation of the first president and his position, President Aguinaldo, and then going down the line into Duterte, who is the current Philippine president. Some of the questions that I have, or that I've been researching is if the Philippine state, it's considered a post-colonial state because it's an independent nation, or if it's a neocolonial state. Some of the things that I've been trying to understand is the way that the American establishment of the Republic of the Philippines basically centers all of the government power in Manila, which is this national capital region that's circled in red. And so this is Manila, which you might know is the capital city of the Philippine archipelago. And it is where it manages the government and the economy of all other islands in the region. But as I said before, the indigenous Filipinos never really saw themselves as unified in that same way, because especially in Mindanao, there's a lot of politics because they were under the Muslim influence, and they have a different political system that's connected to Brunei, which is in Borneo, and in southern another island that's south of the Philippines. But because of the American education system and the media, it creates a different imagination that this is the whole Philippines and they're all unified. So there's contestation if all Philippines is managed under Luzon or Manila, or if it's fragmented. And so this continues to be an issue of, but it underlies a lot of the tensions that we see today. The thing about the government being centered in Manila is that the people that manage that government are a lot of the mestizo elite. So they are descendants of former Spanish and American landowners, and they've mixed with native people, so they're mixed race people, but they're highly wealthy, and they own large tracts of land. And so even if the Philippine Republic was independent, it still had a lot of class inequalities in which peasant farmers are really struggling to survive while there's huge wealth that's in the hands of these landowners who are also politicians and congresspeople. And so there's a lot of uprisings among poor farmers as well as indigenous people trying to protect their lands from more corporate extraction, as well as the Bangsamoro people, fighting for their own autonomous region in the Mindanao area. There's indigenous people in the northern Philippines called the Cordillera, the Ifugao, Benguet, Kalinga, Kankanay. There's different groups that are collectively known as the Igorot. They're also fighting for our own autonomous region. So again, a lot of people don't truly identify under this term Filipino because of this history of they have a different political system, but the colonial systems created a different story. So the crisis right now in the Philippines, an example of the underlying tension is the Mindanao problem. There's the martial law that has been established about 2 years ago since the Duterte regime. I don't know if you guys heard in the news about the bombings of Marawi, which is in Mindanao, in the southern point, this area here. And Philippines has experienced martial law before under the presidency of Ferdinand Marcos. And he, was involved in a lot of World Bank loans, and he wanted to build and industrialize a lot of the development for national energy projects that would benefit Manila. But that would mean that a lot of indigenous peoples, for example, by the rivers that would be part of hydroelectric dams, their homes would have been destroyed. And so that was an example of how these kind of modernization projects that Marcos had established had really been detrimental to a lot of marginal groups. And so because of the resistance at the time, the Philippine state cracked down on that, and there was a lot of human rights violations. So that was our first experience with martial law. The second time is now. We're now doing that again under Duterte. And the current situation in Mindanao, the unrest, because the autonomous region of Mindanao is led by the Bangsamoro people, which are Muslim-influenced peoples of the Philippine in the Mindanao island. And been a history of battles. They never accepted American rule, but American militarization or American-funded militarization that is based in Manila, but so it's Philippine also. It's a Philippine state funded by the United States that is going to Mindanao to repress this Islamic influence. And this was also part of the war on terror and all of that discourse. They've established a lot of military bases. There's been a huge spike in military FMS agreements represent the foreign military sales. So a lot of arms sales have been going to the Philippine state based in Manila to fight wars in Mindanao. And this created some type of desires for peace in Mindanao. And so the MNLF represents the Muslim National Liberation Front. And so this is a particular faction within the Bangsamoro people that seeks to have peace negotiations with Manila. And they seek to stop, war and try to continue talks on how they can negotiate a better relationship with the Manila-based government. The MILF is the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and they are impatient with the speed of the progress that the MNLF has been facilitating, and so they have been more radical in desiring a full secession from the Philippine archipelago political system. And so, as you can see, that even within the Bangsamoro nation, there are tensions about how to deal with the kind of politics that they are in. Recently, about 3 years ago, the Bangsamoro nation tried to further their advancement of this autonomous region under the Bangsamoro Basic Law, which is trying to prove to the Philippine state that they have a judiciary, that they have a legal system that should be recognized in relation to the Philippine North, which is the Manila-based government. But despite all of this kind of development and desires to have some kind of objective conversation about this these different political systems in the Philippine Islands, the militarization has really kind of the arms trade. I'm talking about the arms trade that's been kind of poking at these tensions, and people have been arming themselves, and the Philippine state sending militaries, and then of course all these factions among the Bangsamoro people fighting back has been creating a lot of violence and trauma and displacements and evacuations that not only affect the Christian settlers that went down into Mindanao, but also the Muslim people, the Bangsamoro people, as well as the Indigenous people of Mindanao. So there's all of these different people are currently living in this kind of situation. Question remains. I mean, this is the situation right now in the Philippines. It's very complicated. What is the future of the Philippines? Is it possible? How do we decolonize ourselves from these competing narratives of what is the Philippine nation? Is it possible to demilitarize? Why is the United States supporting the Philippine state for this huge arms economy that the Philippine state is using to repress other parts of the Philippines? So these are the kinds of problems that the Philippines faces today. So if you have any questions, into them now. Otherwise, you can email me. This is my address.
Okay, thank you. That was a lot of information.
We get all that.
I'm gonna go through the questions that we have right now. I keep hearing the voices, sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna go through the questions that we have right now and see if there's anything that wasn't answered.
Okay.
So before anything was colonized, what was their religion like?
Their religion, they were animist, and also because of the Philippines' relation to Indonesia and Southeast Asia, there was also a Hindu-Buddhist influence as well. So there were different. So the animist kind of tradition is a very old religion or spirituality that's common among many indigenous people. So shamanism is kind of a similar, description. Indigenous terms that we called for shamans are babaylan, which is Catalonan. There's different words for them depending on the island that you're on and the language that you speak. And then during the around 1100 to the 1400s, there was a Hindu-Buddhist influence that came from what is currently Thailand down into Indonesia. And there was the Srivijaya Empire, as well as the Mahajapahit empires that were coming out of Indonesia, and they created satellite colonies in the Philippine Islands, which is why, like I mentioned before, there were these different governments here, like the Indianized kingdoms. So these represent the Indian influence, the Hindu Buddhist and the Indian influence. And then they also had Chinese trade. So a lot of Chinese traders also established themselves, had Confucianism, and different things like that. And then we also had the Islamic influence later as well.
And I know about like how there were a lot of people that did come influence. How did that affect their language? And like, did they adapt to like what their colonizers were speaking?
Sorry, can you say that again? It's kind of breaking up.
I just want to know like the language today and like what the main languages are and how it was influenced by their colonizers.
Okay, so the languages, and well, there are about 170 different languages in the Philippines, and the main languages are Tagalog, which is based in Manila. Tagalog is an indigenous language in the Manila region, but it's also the official language along with English, because like I said, it's part of the national government, right? The national capital. And so that's an example of the ways in which the Spanish and the American colonization centered all the political power in the Manila area, which is the Tagalog region. And so that's why Tagalog is a national language, yet it also is a hegemonic language because it is the government language, but it also kind of obscures the other marginal languages in the rest of the archipelago.
Do you have questions?
Not on the list.
Do you have any that you know
Yeah. Michael?
I feel like I had something, I don't know.
Or kind of, so you mentioned a lot of the problems in the country right now, but like with all those problems, do you think that the Philippines is somewhat stable, very unstable? Like where do you think it is on the level of stability?
I think that there are different parts of the Philippines that is safe. I've been to the Philippines 2 years ago, and it was safe in the north. But I remember that it was for a conference or a gathering, and we were supposed to actually meet in Mindanao, in a place called Butuan, which is over here. And so because of the martial law situation, it recently broke out, the meeting had changed, and they said, we're not going to go to Mindanao, we're going to move it to Luzon. So they moved it to the central Luzon area. So you can sense that institutions like the conference, and the groups that were hosting us had a sense that it wasn't safe for them to hold the meeting in Mindanao. So that's my experience with that. But at the same time, I've heard stories of other people having gone to Mindanao recently, like Davao. My friend is in Davao and she's performing there. I've heard of stories of people going and engaging in travels there, and they seem to be safe. And except that there are certain parts of Mindanao that they are told not to go to. So it seems to be that it's open, but then there's certain places to be careful of, and the local people who are hosting you kind of navigate those boundaries. The northern Philippines seems to be quite it's relative, because if you're well off or rich, or you're not doing drugs, or you're going for conferences, or you're going for work, or you're going for tourism, it seems to be safe. I think what's going on is a lot of the poor people are being pushed around and killed, and people that are engaged in critical thinking of the state, they're also being murdered. So it's it depends on how you present yourself or your purpose if you're an outsider going in. I hate to say it. I mean, I hate to say it because, if you understand the history of the Philippines and you're critically thinking about why the Philippine state is the policy of killing other people but at the benefit of others, I feel it's uncomfortable. I feel that's unjust, that it has to be that way. And so to be someone with that critical thinking and to connect with people who are trying to stop that or address that human rights issue, I would like to talk to them and learn from them, right? But at the same time, those human rights advocates and those who are critically thinking are also being the ones profiled and murdered by what we call the extrajudicial killings, which are masked gunmen that go and kill journalists and lawyers that are advocating for people who are in trouble or who are dealing with evictions and are trying to fight back or somehow speak out against the policies. And so it creates this kind of double underworld of these deaths, and yet there's this above world or this kind of open to the world where everything is supposedly safe. So I don't know. I think I don't have a good. It's not good or bad. It's like a very complicated feeling that I have about it. Yeah.
That makes sense.
I'm curious, like, what's this level of development right now? Like, is that?
The level of development. So I remember going to Manila and 2 years ago, and there is certain areas that look like Los Angeles, and it's called like Makati. It's called BCBG. These like very glitzy shopping mall areas that look very modern with smooth roads that are wide and Gucci stores and just any sort of like high-end shop that you would see at your mall, like it would be there in Manila. And then and it's part of that kind of like openness to the world that we're modernizing. But then you also have parts of the Manila that are completely impoverished. Homeless people, peddlers, you can tell people are sleeping on the streets or sleeping in slums. So that's in Manila. And I've never actually traveled to other parts of the Philippines, and that's something that I'm trying to change. And I hear stories about a lot of indigenous peoples being evacuated from their homes in the mountains and being forced to come down into the city. So I imagine that there's a lot of underdevelopment and destruction, and especially around the mining areas and the places where there are places. The Philippines is known for its natural resources, especially in Mindanao and parts of other islands. And so it's not developed, to be like a city, but it's developed to just be mined, and the nature to be destroyed. So you imagine what it looks like to have an open mine pit. I mean, it's horribly ugly. It's not like a shopping mall. It's a place where natural resources are extracted from. So it's underdeveloped because its purpose is to be extracted, and there's possibly factories or mining towns that try to serve the workers, but that's also present in the Philippines.
So I was wondering, like, what the reaction or influence of like other foreign powers or like the UN is in the Philippines and how that's kind of affected.
Yeah. So the UN has been involved in people have been advocating to the UN to try to address this Duterte's war on drugs policy, which included the killings of urban poor who are suspected to be drug peddlers or addicts. And he has been doing it without due process, and a lot of it has to do with killing people, but then the people like the police or the extrajudicial killings, they're not identified or investigated, but there's a lot of dead bodies everywhere, and it's sort of causing a lot of international uproar. And so the UN has been there is a group, the Philippine Indigenous Peoples of Victoria Paly Corpus. She's a chairwoman of the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act that is also backed up by the United Nations. But this woman, this Victoria Paly Corpus, she's try to mobilize some of the indigenous peoples at the international level to condemn what's going on under this administration right now. But then again, the Philippine state under Duterte ended up kind of clapping back at her and saying that she's a terrorist for speaking out against him. So she was kind of feeling scared for her life. It's kind of that kind of situation right now where, people are trying to appeal to a system of law that they can feel like their rights will be protected for speaking out. But then there's somehow this kind of fascist type of government, or I don't know how you want to describe it, but this government that feels like, oh, you're going to talk shit about me? Well, I'm going to try to kill you, like that kind of stuff. And it's like, so the international law, I mean, although it's sort of this exalted level that you hope would have an enforcement power, ultimately it has more of a moralistic enforcement. It doesn't have the teeth, and it has more of a recommendations kind of level of enforcement. And so if the Philippine government that is supposed to be listening to the UN for a moralistic direction, right now it's not listening to the UN, or doesn't give a damn, actually.
One more question. You mentioned something about the Filipino-American War. Can you go into a little bit more detail with that?
Yeah. So the Filipino-American War, like I said before, it came out of the end of the Spanish colonialism era in the Philippines. And this is around 1898 when the Filipinos were trying to fight back against Spain. And the Americans also saw that other Spanish colonies, like in Puerto Rico, Guam, they were also trying to fight back or realize that Spain could no longer control these places because it was losing money. And so America noticed that, and they said, ooh, Spain is waning. How can we be the new person that will take over its former glory? And so that's when the Americans jumped on to broker with Spain to say, hey, we're going to help. We'll take over Philippines. Just give us $2 million. And so that was the deal regarding the Philippines, the Spanish and the control of the Philippines, and to sell it to America. And so, that was like the sort of the backdoor deal that was happening between the two empires, America and Spain. But on the ground, you have Spanish being Americans fighting with Filipinos against the Spanish. And so that also was part of the performance of the kind of imperial takeover or the imperial transference that was on the ground. And so when Spanish agreed that they'll let go Philippines to America, then the Filipinos were like, yay, we're free, right? Thanks, America. Thanks, you're such a buddy. You're so cool. Thanks for helping us out. But then the Americans were like, nope, sorry, dude. You're going to be our new colonial place now. You're going to be our new colony. And so that was like a betrayal to the Filipino revolutionaries that were also kind of working with America, trying to fight this. At the time they were working together, but they felt betrayed. And so the Filipinos, again, the revolutionaries, and they decided to say, hey, we're going to fight against you now, America. We thought you were our friend, but now you're going to take us over and we're going to try to fight you. And so they did. And that was the Filipino-American War. And so imagine the level of exhaustion, right? Like they were just finished fighting Spain. You could imagine the level of the way that the Philippine natives had to be organized to fight against an empire. And then you go through that, but then now you have to fight another one. And so truthfully, the level of the strength of the Philippine army during the Filipino-American War was on its like a shoestring budget. It was like a shoestring budget deal, right? To be simplistic. And so they had to engage in guerrilla warfare and these other types of ways of fighting. And at the same time, Americans came with their machine guns and their automatic, they had more weapons and technology because they came out of World War I and they had huge kind of crazy weapons that they were investing in. And so you can imagine the level of David and Goliath that one was as well. Millions of Filipinos died and a couple of 100,000 American soldiers died. So those are the types of power dynamics that occurred. It was just a very brutal war as well. And it was also had that psychological aspect. So there was the education that was trying to educate those that were in the kind of the secure areas. They were giving them education system under the Thomasites, which are missionaries that came in, and they tried to create an education system that taught Filipinos about American ideals, they learned about snow, they learned about, American pop idols at the time. And so they were trying to teach them to not think about their native identity. And so a remnant or a product of that kind of psychological colonialism is this notion of colonial mentality that exists in the Philippines and in the descendants of the Philippine, the people that live in the diaspora is this notion that Filipinos often will choose Western ways over their native ways because they feel that native ways are Western ways are more superior, and they've internalized that. And a byproduct of that kind of psychology is that there's a huge issue of mental health and like low self-esteem and even suicide among Filipino people, and especially young people, when they feel that this tension in their culture is not addressed and nobody is giving them a space to process it and where it comes from, that it hurts them, and it hurts them psychologically and emotionally, and it creates this kind of substance abuse or other types of domestic violence and other types of problems that occur when people have a pain in their heart that isn't being resolved. So yeah, that's a byproduct, I think, of Filipino-American War.
This has been super helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Like, the entire history of everything.
Thank you.
It's pretty cool.
Okay.
We have like pages of notes. So
Yeah.
We turn them into pages.
Like,
Yeah, no, I have.
Okay.
All right, yeah,
Okay.
thank you so
You're
much for
welcome.
your help.
All right.
If we have any more questions, we'll reach out to you. And maybe when we're done, we'll send you a copy of the research, maybe. I don't know. But
That'll be great.
thank you so much for all the help.
Okay. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
I turned off.